Picture a 21-year-old ruler standing before the greatest city in the world, Constantinople, the crown jewel of the Christian world, the last remnant of the Roman Empire. And Mehmed II wanted it more than anything he'd ever wanted in his life. This wasn't just military ambition. This was obsession. Mehmed had been raised on stories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. His tutors, many of them Greek scholars, had filled his head with classical philosophy and Roman history. He spoke Greek fluently and collected ancient manuscripts like other people collected jewelry. In his mind, he wasn't just conquering a city. He was reclaiming what rightfully belonged to the successor of Rome. But here's the thing about Mehmed that makes his story so tragic. He genuinely loved Byzantine culture. He admired Constantinople's architecture, its libraries, its art. He had plans to transform the city into a new cultural capital, a bridge between East and West. He envisioned himself as a philosopher king ruling from the greatest city ever built. On April 6, 1453, Mehmed's massive army, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men, surrounded Constantinople's legendary walls. The siege was a masterpiece of military engineering. Mehmed had commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build the largest cannons the world had ever seen. These monsters could hurl stone balls weighing over 2,200 pounds. When they fired, the ground shook for miles. For 53 days, those cannons pounded the walls that had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine V Palaeologus led a desperate defense with maybe 7,000 soldiers. They knew they were doomed. Everyone knew. But they fought anyway because that's what you did when you were defending the last fragment of Rome. Now here's where Mehmed made the decision that would haunt him forever. According to Ottoman military tradition, there were two ways to take a city. If the city surrendered, the population would be spared, their property protected, their churches left standing. But if the city resisted and had to be taken by force, well, that was different. That meant the soldiers got their reward. 3 days of unrestricted pillage. 3 days where everything in the city belonged to whoever could take it. Mehmed sent multiple offers to Constantine. Surrender, and your people will be safe. Fight, and my soldiers get 3 days. Constantine, to his credit or his doom, refused every offer. He would not surrender the city his ancestors had defended for over a millennium. So Mehmed prepared his men for the final assault, knowing exactly what would happen if they succeeded. On the night of May 28th, Mehmed gave his troops the traditional speech before a final assault. Fight bravely, breach those walls, and Constantinople is yours. For 3 days, everything you can carry, everyone you can capture, all of it belongs to you. It was standard military practice for the time. European armies did the same thing. This was how warfare worked in 1453. At dawn on May 29th, after 7 hours of continuous assault, the Ottoman forces finally broke through. Constantine XIX died, fighting somewhere near the walls. Nobody knows exactly where or how. His body was never definitively identified. The last Roman emperor simply vanished into the chaos of that morning. And then the pillaging began. Mehmed had promised his soldiers 3 days, and he was a man of his word. What he didn't fully grasp was what 3 days of unrestricted violence would do to the city he'd spent months dreaming about transforming into his capital. The young sultan who loved Greek culture and Roman history was about to watch his own army destroy everything he'd fought to possess. He'd conquered Constantinople. But the real horror was only beginning. The Ottoman soldiers who poured through the breached walls on May 29th weren't thinking about Mehmed's dreams for a cultural capital. They were thinking about 3 days of promised rewards. And they'd earned it. They'd spent 53 days getting bombarded by desperate defenders. They'd watched their friends die climbing ladders and filling trenches. Now it was payday. Here's what those 3 days actually looked like, based on accounts from multiple witnesses who survived. And we have quite a few witnesses because this was one of the most documented events of the medieval period. Greek historians like Ducas were there. Archbishop Leonardo of Chios wrote detailed accounts. Even Ottoman chroniclers like Tursun Beg described what happened, though usually with less graphic detail. The first wave of soldiers went straight for the wealthy districts. They broke into homes, dragged out families, and started sorting people like merchandise. Young, healthy men and women, those would fetch good prices in the slave markets. Children, also valuable. Elderly people, not worth the trouble of feeding during the march back to Ottoman territory. Historical records don't explicitly state what happened to them, but you can figure it out from the silence. Churches became death traps. Thousands of people had fled to Constantinople's famous churches, believing they'd be sanctuaries. They were wrong. Soldiers smashed through the doors and found crowds of terrified civilians packed inside. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, became a holding pen for captives. People were chained together in groups and herded outside to be sorted and sold. But the systematic pillaging was actually organized compared to what happened in the residential areas. Soldiers went house to house, street by street. They took everything valuable: gold, silver, artwork, religious icons, furniture, food, wine. When there was nothing left to carry, they destroyed what remained. Not out of particular cruelty, but because that's what happened when you gave tens of thousands of armed men permission to take whatever they wanted with no consequences. The sexual violence was widespread, though historical sources from the period tend to use euphemistic language. Contemporary accounts mention that women and young boys were dishonored before being enslaved. We know from records of slave markets in the weeks following the conquest that thousands of Constantinople's residents ended up being sold throughout the Ottoman Empire. Now here's the crucial context that history classes often skip. This wasn't uniquely Ottoman brutality. This was standard 15th century warfare. When European armies sacked cities, they did the same things. The Crusaders had sacked Constantinople in 1204 and behaved just as badly, maybe worse. The 3-day pillage rule existed because it was considered a legitimate military reward. If you wanted soldiers to risk their lives climbing walls and charging into defender fire, you had to offer them something beyond regular pay. Mehmed himself wasn't participating in the pillage. He'd set up command outside the city, waiting for the 3 days to end. According to sources, he spent those days receiving reports about which districts had fallen, which nobles had been captured, what treasures had been found. He was following standard procedure. He'd made a promise to his troops, and breaking that promise would have been seen as a massive betrayal that could threaten his authority as Sultan. But on the 3rd day, June 1st, when Mehmed finally entered Constantinople, something happened that multiple sources document. He rode through the streets, seeing the destruction for the first time. Buildings burned, bodies in the streets, the Hagia Sophia stripped of its treasures and covered in debris. The Greek historian Critobulus, who later worked for Mehmed, wrote that the Sultan wept when he saw what had become of the city. There's a famous story, documented by several sources, about Mehmed's visit to the Hagia Sophia. He found a soldier smashing marble floor tiles, trying to pry out pieces to take as loot. Mehmed reportedly struck the soldier and shouted something like, "The buildings are mine, the contents were yours." He was furious that the architectural fabric of the city was being destroyed, but his anger came too late. The 3 days were over, and Constantinople looked like it had been hit by a natural disaster. The population, which had been somewhere around 50,000 before the siege, was now a fraction of that. Tens of thousands had been marched away in chains to be sold in slave markets across the empire. Buildings stood empty and ransacked. The streets were littered with debris and corpses. Mehmed had conquered Constantinople. He'd achieved what no Ottoman sultan before him had managed. He was now Mehmed the Conqueror, the sultan who finally took the city that had resisted Ottoman sieges for decades. But as he stood in the ruined Hagia Sophia on June 1, 1453, the young sultan was beginning to realize that military victory and personal triumph were two very different things. He'd won the city, but what he'd won was a devastated shell of what he'd dreamed about. And the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life was simple. Was it worth it? Within weeks of taking Constantinople, Mehmed started killing people. Not enemy soldiers, not rebels, his own people. The men who'd helped him achieve his greatest victory. And if you look at the pattern of who died and when, a disturbing picture emerges. Let's start with Lucas Notaras. He was the Megas Du, the Grand Admiral of Byzantium, one of the highest-ranking officials who'd survived the conquest. Mehmed initially treated him well. They had conversations. Notaras knew the city intimately, knew where treasures were hidden, knew the administrative systems. He was valuable. Then, in early June, something changed. Multiple sources document what happened next, though they differ on the specific trigger. According to most accounts, Mehmed demanded that Notaras hand over his 14-year-old son, supposedly for the Sultan's personal pleasure. Notaras refused. Within hours, Notaras, his sons, and his son-in-law were all executed. Their heads were displayed publicly. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Some historians think the son story was a pretext. Mehmed needed an excuse to eliminate someone who knew too much about what had happened during those 3 days. Notaras had been in the city. He'd witnessed the pillage. He could tell stories that might complicate Mehmed's carefully constructed image as a just conqueror. But Notaras was just the beginning. In July 1453, Mehmed executed his Grand Vizier, Halil Pasha. This wasn't some minor official. This was the second most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire, Mehmed's chief advisor. Halil Pasha had opposed the siege of Constantinople from the start. He'd argued it was too risky, too expensive, that it would unite Christian Europe against the Ottomans. He'd been right about the risks, even if the conquest succeeded. The official reason for Halil Pasha's execution was treason, supposedly accepting bribes from the Byzantines. But the timing is suspicious. Halil Pasha had been one of the few high-ranking officials who'd witnessed both the planning of the conquest and its aftermath. He knew what Mehmed had promised the troops. He knew what that promise had cost. And he'd never wanted the conquest in the first place. Dead men tell no inconvenient truths. Contemporary Ottoman sources are careful about how they describe this period. They talk about Mehmed consolidating power and eliminating opposition. But if you read between the lines, you see a pattern. The people Mehmed killed or sidelined in the months and years after 1453 were often people who'd been close to the conquest, who'd seen what happened, who could contradict the official narrative that was already forming. Here's something that modern historians have noted. Mehmed became obsessed with controlling the story of Constantinople's fall. He commissioned multiple histories, but only from historians who'd portray events in specific ways. Critobulus of Imbros, a Greek historian who wrote a chronicle of Mehmed's reign, was careful to emphasize the Sultan's mercy and cultural sophistication. The accounts that survive from Mehmed's court focus on the engineering genius of the siege, the bravery of the assault, the Sultan's vision for rebuilding. They're much less detailed about May 29th through June 1st. The most chilling part is how systematic it became. Over the next few years, various commanders and officials who'd been present at Constantinople met unfortunate ends. Some were executed for corruption. Others died in suspicious circumstances. A few were simply reassigned to distant provinces where they couldn't talk to foreign ambassadors or visiting dignitaries. Now, we need to be careful here. We don't have smoking gun evidence that Mehmed systematically murdered everyone who witnessed the pillage. That would be speculation. What we do have is a documented pattern of executions and deaths among people who'd been present at the conquest, a pattern that continued for years. We have sources describing Mehmed's increasing paranoia and distrust. We have the undeniable fact that the Sultan, who'd been relatively merciful to Byzantine officials in his early reign, became notorious for sudden, brutal executions after 1453. There's another element to this that sources from the period mention. Mehmed started having trouble sleeping. He'd always been energetic, but after Constantinople, something changed. Court officials noticed he'd walk the palace at night. He became suspicious of his food, his servants, his closest advisors. The young man who'd boldly led armies seemed constantly afraid that someone was plotting against him. Was it guilt? Was it paranoia that survivors would undermine his legacy? Was it the simple psychological weight of being responsible for what had happened during those 3 days? We can't know his internal thoughts. What we know is that the 21-year-old who conquered Constantinople and the man who ruled for the next 28 years were, in many ways, different people. The conquest had changed him fundamentally. And here's the tragic irony. Mehmed got exactly what he wanted. He became Mehmed the Conqueror. History remembers him as one of the greatest military leaders of the medieval period. The Ottomans held Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, for nearly 500 years. By any military or political measure, the conquest was a triumph. But the young sultan who'd dreamed of being a philosopher king ruling a cultural capital had become something else entirely, something that frightened even his own courtiers. The victory had cost him more than the lives of his enemies. It had cost him whatever innocence a 21-year-old sultan might have possessed. And he was starting to understand that some prices can't be calculated until after you've paid them. By 1460, 7 years after the conquest, Mehmed II had transformed from a young conqueror into something that resembled a Byzantine emperor himself, the paranoid kind. The Sultan who'd once enjoyed debating philosophy with Greek scholars now saw conspiracies everywhere, and his response was simple: kill first, investigate later. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention at court. An official would rise to prominence, gain Mehmed's trust, serve loyally for months or years, and then suddenly fall from grace. Sometimes they'd be executed publicly, other times they'd simply disappear. Their property would be confiscated. Their families would be quietly dispersed to distant provinces, and nobody at court would dare ask what happened. Let's talk about the atmosphere in Mehmed's palace during this period. Contemporary sources describe a court where everyone walked on eggshells. Ambassadors from Venice and other European powers noted the palpable fear among Ottoman officials. They'd seen confident men reduced to terrified functionaries, constantly watching their words, afraid to offer honest counsel because honesty might get them killed. The administrative system started suffering. When your sultan might execute you for giving bad news, you stopped giving accurate reports. Officials began telling Mehmed what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. Military commanders exaggerated victories and minimized defeats. Tax collectors inflated revenue projections. The efficient Ottoman bureaucracy that had helped build the empire was being corrupted by fear. But here's where Mehmed's paranoia revealed its source. He became obsessed with loyalty tests, particularly around the memory of Constantinople. He'd question officials about what they remembered from the siege, what they'd seen during those 3 days, what stories they'd heard. It was like he was constantly checking whether people knew too much or were spreading the wrong narratives about the conquest. Foreign observers noticed this fixation. Italian merchants who'd been in Constantinople before and after the conquest found themselves interrogated about what they'd witnessed. Greek scholars who'd survived the siege and entered Mehmed's service walked a dangerous line, valuable for their knowledge, but potentially dangerous for their memories. The religious dimension made everything more complicated. Mehmed had converted the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, which was standard practice for Islamic conquerors. But he'd also promised to protect other Christian churches and communities. He needed Constantinople to be a functioning city, which meant keeping some of its Christian population. But how do you maintain a Christian community when your own soldiers had enslaved thousands of Christians just years earlier? How do you ask them to trust you? The repatriation program Mehmed instituted reveals this tension. He forced Greeks, Armenians, and Jews from other parts of his empire to relocate to Constantinople to repopulate it. But these weren't voluntary migrations. People were compelled to move, given property that had belonged to enslaved or murdered previous owners, and told to rebuild their lives in a city that had been traumatized. Imagine being forced to move into a home where the previous family had been dragged away in chains. Now let's address the law that made Mehmed infamous even by the brutal standards of medieval monarchs. Around 1478, he formally codified fratricide as legal imperial policy. The law stated essentially that whichever son inherited the throne had the right, even the duty, to execute his brothers for the good of the state. The justification was that this prevented the civil wars that had plagued earlier Ottoman succession. But here's the context historians often provide. Fratricide wasn't new. Ottoman princes had been killing each other over succession for generations. Mehmed's own rise to power had involved factional violence. What Mehmed did was make it official, legal, systematic. He took something that happened in the shadows and brought it into the light, claiming it was rational state policy, rather than murderous ambition. Some historians argue this law reveals Mehmed's psychological state after Constantinople. He'd learned that holding power sometimes required doing terrible things, that victory demanded sacrifices that haunted you afterward, that the good of the state could justify almost anything. He'd destroyed a city to save it. Why not kill your brothers to prevent civil war? The law had immediate and brutal consequences. When Mehmed died in 1481, his son Bayezid II immediately had his younger brother Cem murdered, citing the law their father had established. The fratricide law would remain Ottoman policy for centuries, leading to the deaths of countless princes. Mehmed's attempt to prevent civil war through legalized murder became one of the darkest aspects of Ottoman succession. But back to Mehmed himself in his final years. The historical sources paint a picture of a man consumed by his legacy. He commissioned histories, sponsored art, built monuments, all trying to shape how future generations would remember him. He expanded the empire through additional conquests, each victory a way to add to his reputation. He was still brilliant, still capable of complex strategic thinking. But the lightness, the intellectual curiosity, the humanistic interests of his youth, all of that seemed buried under layers of suspicion and control. Court physicians noted his declining health in his final years. He suffered from gout, a painful condition that medieval medicine couldn't effectively treat. He was overweight, probably from the stress and sedentary lifestyle of constant administration. Some sources suggest he had digestive problems. There are theories, though unproven, that he was eventually poisoned, possibly by his own son, who was impatient for the throne. When Mehmed II died on May 3, 1481, at age 49, he'd ruled the Ottoman Empire for 30 years since the conquest of Constantinople. He'd expanded Ottoman territory significantly. He'd made the Ottomans the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. By every objective measure of success for a medieval monarch, he'd won. But the cost of that victory, the psychological price paid by the young man who'd wept in the ruined Hagia Sophia, that's harder to calculate. The paranoid emperor who died in 1481 bore little resemblance to the ambitious 21-year-old who'd dreamed of being the new Caesar. Constantinople had made him Mehmed the Conqueror, but it had taken something essential in the process, something he'd spent the rest of his life trying to forget. Here's something that gets lost in the triumphant histories of the Ottoman Empire. Constantinople never fully recovered from May 29, 1453. Not during Mehmed's lifetime. Not for decades afterward. The city that had been the crown jewel of the Mediterranean became a semi-ruined monument to the cost of absolute victory. Let's look at the numbers, or rather the absence of numbers. Before the siege, Constantinople's population was somewhere around 50,000, already drastically reduced from its peak of maybe 400,000 in earlier centuries. After the three-day sack and the mass enslavement, estimates suggest the population dropped to perhaps 10,000. The city that had been one of the world's great urban centers was suddenly a ghost town, with people living in pockets among empty, damaged buildings. Mehmed's solution was forced relocation on a massive scale. He implemented a policy called sürgün, essentially state-mandated population transfer. Greeks from the Peloponnese, Armenians from Anatolia, Jews from throughout the empire, all were ordered to resettle in Constantinople. Not asked, ordered. Families were uprooted, given property that belonged to enslaved or dead previous owners, and told to rebuild. Contemporary accounts describe what this looked like. Entire neighborhoods stood empty. Churches had been converted to mosques or stood abandoned. The famous forums and public spaces that had defined Roman and Byzantine urban life were partially demolished or repurposed. The aqueducts that had supplied water for over a millennium were damaged and needed extensive repairs. Constantinople had to be rebuilt almost from scratch, but with the traumatic memory of its destruction hanging over everything. The economic impact was staggering. Constantinople had been a major commercial hub, the connection point between Europe and Asia, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The Genoese and Venetian merchants who dominated trade through the city largely fled. Their networks, built over generations, were shattered. It would take decades to rebuild commercial relationships, and when they did, the terms favored Ottoman merchants and administrators, not the international traders who'd made the city wealthy. But here's where Mehmed's vision for the city revealed its fundamental contradiction. He wanted Constantinople to be a great cultural capital, and he spent enormous resources trying to make that happen. He built new mosques, including the Fatih Mosque complex. He established markets. He invited scholars and artists from across the Islamic world and even from Europe. Italian architects and engineers came to work on his projects. Greek scholars who'd survived the conquest were given positions in his court. Yet the foundation of this new Constantinople was built on the bones and memories of what had been destroyed. How do you create a cultural renaissance in a city where everyone knows what happened just years earlier? The Greek communities Mehmed needed for administrative continuity couldn't forget that their relatives had been enslaved. The relocated Armenians and Jews knew they were living in confiscated property. The Ottoman officials administering the city had participated in or witnessed its destruction. The psychological atmosphere this created was toxic. Trust was impossible. The various religious and ethnic communities lived in proximity but not in harmony. Mehmed established the millet system, which gave religious communities a degree of self-governance. But this was as much about control as tolerance. Divide the population into manageable groups. Make their leaders responsible for their community's behavior, and everyone polices everyone else. Let's talk about what happened to the enslaved population from Constantinople. This is a part of the story that's often glossed over, but the historical records are clear. Thousands of people from Constantinople ended up in slave markets throughout the Ottoman Empire. We have documents showing Greeks from the city being sold in Bursa, Edirne, and even as far as Egypt. Families were separated. Skilled craftsmen found themselves property of new masters. Young women disappeared into harems. Children were absorbed into Ottoman households or, in some cases, taken for the devshirme system, converted to Islam and trained for military or administrative service. Some of these enslaved people eventually gained their freedom. The Ottoman system, unlike some other forms of slavery, had mechanisms for manumission. But the trauma of enslavement, the destruction of families and communities, that damage was permanent. And everyone in Constantinople knew this. The city was haunted by the ghosts of its own recent past. Mehmed's building projects were partially an attempt to literally cover up this past. Build new mosques over ruined churches, construct new palaces over Byzantine administrative buildings, replace Greek inscriptions with Arabic calligraphy, create a new identity for the city that would make people forget what it had been. But memory doesn't work that way. The Greek community preserved oral histories of the conquest. Stories were passed down through generations about the last day of the Byzantine Empire, the 3 days of horror, the relatives who never came home. The European Christian world turned Constantinople's fall into propaganda. The story became a rallying cry for crusades, a warning about the Ottoman threat, a tragedy that proved Islamic civilization was barbaric. This was deeply hypocritical, given that European armies had sacked Constantinople in 1204 and behaved just as brutally. But hypocrisy doesn't diminish the power of narrative. For centuries, the fall of Constantinople was remembered in European art, literature, and political rhetoric as a civilizational catastrophe. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman world, the conquest became the greatest achievement of the empire. Mehmed the Conqueror was celebrated as the fulfillment of Islamic prophecies about taking the city. The brutality of the conquest was minimized or justified as necessary for victory. The 3 days of pillage became a footnote in triumphant histories about the rise of Ottoman power. But here's what's fascinating when you look at Ottoman internal sources from later periods. There's ambivalence. Some Ottoman historians and intellectuals writing decades or centuries later expressed discomfort about the destruction of Constantinople. They recognized that something valuable had been lost, that the conquest, while militarily brilliant, had come at a cultural cost. These weren't the dominant voices, but they existed. The city itself became a physical manifestation of this contradiction. Byzantine mosaics were covered but not destroyed in many churches turned mosques. The Hagia Sophia kept its basic structure even as Islamic decoration was added. Ottoman architects borrowed Byzantine architectural techniques. The new Constantinople was built literally on top of the old one, unable to fully erase it, unwilling to fully preserve it. And through all of this, for 28 years after the conquest, Mehmed ruled. Building, expanding, consolidating, always trying to prove that the victory had been worth it, that the price paid in 1453 had purchased something valuable, that history would remember him as a great emperor, not as a young man who'd unleashed forces he couldn't control. Every new mosque, every conquered territory, every diplomatic triumph was an argument against the accusation that haunted him, that maybe, just maybe, he'd destroyed something irreplaceable for a victory that could have been achieved differently. When Mehmed II died on May 3, 1481, the official cause was listed as natural illness, probably gout. He was 49 years old, not particularly old but not young either, especially for someone who'd lived under the constant stress of ruling an empire and fighting almost continuous military campaigns. His body was swollen from the gout, his health had been declining for years, and court physicians had been treating him with the medical techniques of the era, which probably did more harm than good. But there were immediate rumors of poison. Of course there were. When a sultan dies, especially one who'd established legal fratricide and created an atmosphere of paranoia, everyone assumes murder. Some sources suggested his son Bayezid had him poisoned, impatient to take the throne and eliminate his brother Cem, before Cem could challenge him. Other theories pointed to various court factions. We'll never know the truth. Medieval poisoning is almost impossible to prove centuries later, and the Ottoman court had every reason to suppress any suggestion that the great Mehmed the Conqueror had been murdered by his own family. What we do know is this: Mehmed died without reconciling the fundamental contradiction of his life. He'd achieved everything a medieval monarch could dream of achieving. He'd conquered Constantinople, the city that had resisted Muslim armies for 800 years. He'd expanded Ottoman territory into the Balkans, Anatolia, and around the Black Sea. He'd made the Ottomans the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. He'd built mosques, sponsored scholars, patronized artists. His court was cosmopolitan, bringing together Muslims, Christians, and Jews in his administration. By every objective measure, he was one of history's great emperors. And yet, the historical sources from his later years describe a man who couldn't sleep, who trusted no one, who executed loyal officials on suspicion, who built walls around his palace and posted guards in his bedroom, who looked at his greatest achievement, Constantinople, and saw a reminder of what victory had cost. The young man who'd wept in the Hagia Sophia on June 1st, 1453, never really left that ruined church. He spent the rest of his life trying to justify what had happened there. Here's the cruel irony. Mehmed wanted to be remembered as a Renaissance prince, a patron of culture, a bridge between civilizations. He collected Greek manuscripts. He commissioned Italian artists like Gentile Bellini to paint his portrait. He wrote poetry in Persian. He studied philosophy and enjoyed debating with scholars. In another life, under different circumstances, he might have been the enlightened ruler he dreamed of being. But history doesn't work that way. You can't separate the patron of arts from the conqueror who allowed 3 days of unrestricted violence. You can't celebrate the brilliant military strategist without acknowledging what military victory actually meant for the tens of thousands who were enslaved, killed, or displaced. Mehmed wanted to be both the conqueror and the civilized emperor. The weight of being both destroyed something essential in him. The fratricide law he established tells you everything you need to know about what the conquest did to his moral framework. He took the brutal reality of power struggles and made it official policy. He argued that killing your brothers was rational, necessary, good for the state. This is what happens when you've already justified so much violence in pursuit of glory. The next justification becomes easier. And the next. Until you're executing your own Grand Vizier and sleeping with weapons next to your bed. Ottoman historians in later centuries struggled with Mehmed's legacy. They celebrated the conquest, obviously. It was the foundation of Ottoman control over the Eastern Mediterranean for nearly 5 centuries. But they also recognized something troubled about Mehmed himself. The paranoia, the executions, the gap between his cultural aspirations and his political brutality. Some tried to blame bad advisors or court intrigues. Others suggested the stress of ruling had changed him. Few were willing to say what the evidence suggests, that May 29, 1453, broke something in the 21-year-old sultan that never healed. European historians, of course, painted Mehmed as a monster. For centuries, he was the villain in Western narratives about the fall of Constantinople, the destroyer of civilization, the example of Islamic barbarism. This was propaganda, deeply unfair given that European armies had done identical things countless times. But propaganda works because it contains a kernel of recognizable truth. Mehmed had allowed the destruction of one of the world's great cities. The fact that it was standard military practice for the era doesn't change what happened. Modern historians try to find balance. They recognize Mehmed's genuine accomplishments, his military genius, his administrative reforms, his attempts at cultural synthesis. They also don't shy away from the brutality, the executions, the paranoia, the gap between his aspirations and his actions. The consensus seems to be that Mehmed was brilliant, ambitious, culturally sophisticated, and ultimately consumed by the violence necessary to achieve his goals. But here's what strikes me about Mehmed's story. He won. Completely. Decisively. His empire lasted centuries. His conquest of Constantinople changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean. He got everything he fought for. And it still wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. Because victory built on 3 days of horror carries a weight that no amount of subsequent achievement can balance. There's a broader lesson here about power, violence, and consequences. Mehmed made a choice on April 6, 1453, when he started the siege. He could have offered better terms. He could have found another way. But he wanted total victory, complete conquest, the glory of taking the unconquerable city. And he got it. The city fell. The victory was absolute. The cost was Constantinople's destruction and his own psychological unraveling. This is the tragedy of Mehmed II. Not that he failed, but that he succeeded. He achieved everything he wanted and discovered that success built on that much violence, that many bodies, that much trauma becomes its own form of defeat. The conqueror conquered everything except the memory of what conquest required. The young sultan who dreamed of being the new Caesar became something darker, something that frightened his own people, something that no amount of subsequent building or cultural patronage could redeem. When they buried Mehmed in his mosque complex in Constantinople, the city he'd destroyed to possess, they buried one of history's most successful conquerors. But they also buried a man who'd spent 28 years running from the consequences of 3 days in May 1453. A man who'd won an empire, but lost something essential about himself in the process. A man who proved that you can conquer the world and still be defeated by your own victory. That's the real horror of Mehmed II's story. Not that he lost, but that he won, and winning destroyed him just as surely as defeat would have.